June 15th, 1943. Grumman's Bethpage plant, Long Island, New York. The rhythmic clang of rivet guns echoed through Hangar Four like the heartbeat of an empire in motion. Outside, rows of new F6F Hellcats gleamed beneath the midday sun, fresh paint still tacky, smell of solvent mixing with summer heat. On the far edge of the assembly line, a 36-year-old mechanic named Eddie Price stood over a stripped engine cowling, his grease-stained hands hovering over something that officially did not exist. In the dim light of his corner workstation lay the object of quiet heresy. A two-stage mechanical supercharger, its compressor impeller modified with hand-filed vanes that curved just slightly differently from Grumman's approved design. The alteration added less than a pound of metal, but to Eddie, it meant everything. It was his answer to a question that no one in Naval Bureau of Aeronautics wanted to hear. Why can't the Hellcat climb higher than 28,000 feet? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Officially, the Bureau had already decided. The F6F was to be a carrier fighter optimized for mid-altitude combat, where Japanese Zeros and bombers most often operated. High-altitude performance, they argued, was the concern of land-based interceptors like the P-38 Lightning or P-47 Thunderbolt. On paper, the Hellcat's single-stage two-speed Pratt & Whitney R2-80010 engine was good enough. In Washington, good enough was a virtue. But Price, a civilian engineer turned assembly foreman, had been receiving letters from pilots returning from the Solomon Islands and the Gilberts. One of them, a friend from his test group days, had written bluntly from Guadalcanal, "We can't climb with them after 20,000. They go up and we're left watching, the Zeros still king above the clouds." Price had underlined that sentence in grease pencil and taped it to his locker. It haunted him, because it was true. The irony of the Pacific War's third year was cruel. America had outbuilt Japan tenfold in aircraft, outtrained them and outgunned them, but above 25,000 feet, the Navy still ceded the sky to the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter designed before the war even began. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai 12 engine, despite its modest horsepower, used a supercharger impeller optimized for thinner air. Its pilots called the high altitudes the realm of gods. And while the Hellcat was winning the air war through durability and numbers, men like Price couldn't accept that the enemy still ruled any part of the heavens. Inside Grumman, Price's obsession became a problem. He had begun experimenting after hours, machining subtle adjustments to the supercharger diffuser casing, altering angles, reshaping the diffuser throat to accelerate the charge air slightly faster before the mixture entered the intercooler. The goal wasn't brute power, it was density retention. In theory, his modification could let the Hellcat maintain its rated manifold pressure at 36,000 feet instead of falling off after 28. But in practice, it was an unauthorized change to the Navy's most vital fighter aircraft. And so, to protect his job, he worked in silence, his small rebellion masked beneath the sanctioned roar of the assembly floor. What Price didn't know was that half a world away, on an island airstrip north of Rabaul, Japanese engineers were confronting the same question from the opposite end of despair. Lieutenant Commander Masao Fuchida, Air Operations Officer for the 252nd Air Group, recorded in his post-war memoir, "The new American fighter, the Hellcat, seems unstoppable below the clouds, but at great altitude we can still escape them. Our Zeros climb better, still. It is the last, the place we can breathe freely." That illusion of refuge of altitude as sanctuary was about to die, because Price's banned supercharger, a hand-built prototype rejected by the Bureau for being unnecessary, would soon find its way into a small batch of F6 F5 test aircraft at Naval Air Station Patuxent River. And from that moment, the mathematics of altitude warfare in the Pacific would shift in ways no one had predicted. The story of how it happened begins not with the roar of engines, but with bureaucracy specifically, the design philosophy that nearly crippled American naval aviation before it ever met the enemy. In 1941, When Grumman began sketching the first prototypes of what would become the F6F, the Navy's performance requirements reflected an old-world doctrine. Carrier fighters were defensive by nature. Their task was to protect the fleet, not chase the enemy into the stratosphere. The Hellcat was conceived as an evolution of the Wildcat, not a revolution. Wide wings for low-speed stability, sturdy landing gear for rough carrier decks, thick armor for survivability. In short, it was designed to endure. Meanwhile, over in Japan, the Imperial Navy had pursued the opposite ideal. Every gram of metal in the Zero served one god: maneuverability. Pilots were to be extensions of the aircraft, their bodies light, their faith in their engines absolute. The very concept of armor was considered unspiritual, a burden that only those afraid of dying would demand. Thus, while the Hellcat carried 212 pounds of protective plating and self-sealing tanks that could take dozens of hits, the Zero carried none. And so, the two machines embodied the philosophies of their nations, one a fortress, the other a blade. But altitude was the one domain that blurred those lines, because up there, armor meant little, and power meant everything. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, Allied test engineers at Wright Field and Patuxent River had documented a consistent shortcoming in the Hellcat's R2800 engine. Its single-stage, a two-speed supercharger could not maintain rated power above 24,000 feet. By contrast, land-based fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt used a two-stage, two-speed unit with an intercooler, maintaining full manifold pressure past 30,000. The Navy, mindful of weight and maintenance, rejected the upgrade. Aircraft carriers were crowded, engine swaps risky, spare parts precious. "We don't fight above 25,000 feet," the Bureau's report stated flatly in March 1943. The Zero's advantage at high altitude is operationally irrelevant. To Eddie Price, that was heresy disguised as logic. He had been with Grumman since the Wildcat days, back when engineers still hand-trimmed airfoils with files instead of blueprints. He knew how quickly irrelevant could become fatal. By mid-1943, combat reports from the Central Pacific were already showing increasing Japanese use of high-altitude hit-and-run tactics. The A6M5 Model Zero, introduced that summer, featured modified exhaust stacks providing marginal thrust augmentation, giving it a slight edge above 25,000 feet. Hellcat pilots often reported ghost contacts enemy fighters, diving from invisible heights, firing, then vanishing into the sun. In one report from Task Force 58, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell described the frustration vividly. "At full throttle and blower high, she just won't climb past 28 without losing her breath. You can feel her lungs give out. It's like chasing a ghost uphill with a sack of bricks on your back." Buell's words reached Grumman through internal channels. But by then, the Navy's procurement schedule was locked. No redesigns, no experiments, no unauthorized field mods. So Price did what only a mechanic with nothing left to lose would do. He built one anyway. His modifications were simple, even elegant. He altered the impeller blade pitch by 1.5 degrees to increase compression ratio under low-density air. Then he widened the diffuser outlet by a few millimeters to reduce back pressure, a delicate balance that, on paper, risked detonation or bearing failure. But in his calculations, it would hold. He called it the 38 Special, a name that existed only in his notebook. In late July, he quietly installed one of his units into a test engine bound for Patuxent River. The official paperwork listed it as a refurbished R280010W, Lot 5. The W stood for water injection, but in Price's mind, it stood for what if. When the engine arrived in Maryland, the test crew unaware of the alteration reported anomalous results. At 30,000 feet, the modified Hellcat maintained 47 inches of manifold pressure, nearly 10 more than expected. At 38,000 feet, it still climbed, sluggishly but surely. The test pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bill Leonard, noted in his log, "Power held higher than any Hellcat I've flown. Suspect instrument error. Recheck data." The data was rechecked. It was correct, but by then, the Bureau's own inspectors had discovered Price's unauthorized alterations back in Bethpage. The memo that followed was blunt. Effective immediately. Edward Price relieved of supervisory duties pending investigation for deviation from authorized engine specifications. Price's career was over. The 38 Special was grounded. And yet, its secret lived on because the test results, quietly circulated among engineers, could not be unseen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. When Grumman engineers met in August 1943 to finalize the next production model, the F6F they incorporated subtle revisions to the R2800's intercooler ducting and supercharger tolerances. Officially, these were standard efficiency improvements. Unofficially, they were Price's fingerprints. By the time the new aircraft reached the Pacific in early 1944, pilots began to notice something extraordinary. "She just keeps climbing," one pilot wrote from the USS Bunker Hill. "At 35,000 she still got bite. I saw a zero try to follow. He stalled out and fell like a leaf." The irony was complete. A design once mocked for being too heavy, too clumsy, too grounded now outclimbed the very aircraft that had defined aerial grace. And the man responsible was gone. His name erased from the records as quietly as he had filed those impeller vanes by hand. February 19th, 1944. Aboard the USS Bunker Hill, Task Force 58 prepared for the first carrier strikes against the Japanese stronghold of Truk Lagoon. The dawn air smelled of cordite and aviation fuel, the deck trembling as mechanics checked propeller clearances and wiped oil streaks from cowling seams. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 8 were tense but confident. They had flown the new F6F 5 seconds for barely a week, and already rumours had spread among them of something remarkable. They called it the high blower miracle. Lieutenant John Jack Wyman, a wiry 23-year-old from San Diego, was one of the few who had tested the aircraft's ceiling. During training over Majuro, his wingman's engine had faltered at 29,000 feet, while his own had continued climbing past 35 without complaint. They had landed with identical fuel loads, yet his aircraft's manifold pressure readings made no sense according to the manual. The maintenance crew had chalked it up to instrument error, but Wyman knew better. He'd flown Wildcats before, knew how engines gasped for air above 30,000. This Hellcat, though it breathed differently. Now, on that grey Pacific morning, Wyman sat in his cockpit listening to the whine of his R2800 supercharger spool to high speed. Below deck, the carrier's engines rumbled like distant thunder. The launch officer's signal flag rose, then dropped. Wyman's Hellcat shot down the deck and into the wind. Above Truk Lagoon, the Japanese garrison had scrambled what remained of its fighter force, about 60 Zeros of the 204th and 252nd Air Groups. Their pilots, veterans of Rabaul and the Solomons, were experienced but weary. Their aircraft were lighter, more fragile, their engines worn from salt air and shortages of high-octane fuel. Yet they still held one advantage, or so they believed. The upper sky. Commander Kiyoshi Kaneko, leading the intercept from Etten Island, had ordered his Zeros to climb to 35,000 feet before the American carriers arrived. There, in the realm where the Sakai engine's supercharger could still bite thin air, the Japanese pilots waited, scanning the pale horizon for contrails. They would not have to wait long. At 0930 hours, radar operators aboard Bunker Hill reported multiple enemy contacts at 32,000 feet, an altitude once considered unreachable for carrier-based aircraft. Wyman and his division were vectored to intercept. The climb took less than 9 minutes. As the altimeter passed 30,000, Wyman could feel the slight shudder of the thin air, the stick pressure lightening. He opened the throttle fully, feeling the secondary stage of the supercharger engage with a metallic whine. The needle held steady at 48 inches of manifold pressure impossible. By the book, then he saw them, 11 specks glinting above, sunlit ghosts turning lazily in formation. Zeros. Kaneko's formation broke to intercept, expecting the American fighters to falter in the climb, as they always had. But these Hellcats kept coming steady, deliberate, their wings level. The first pass was brief and brutal. Wyman's flight came in from below and behind, using the sun for cover. When the Hellcats leveled off at 36,000, the Zeros tried to follow, but their climb rate collapsed. At that altitude, the Sakai-21's Supercharger produced barely half its rated power. Fuel mixture sputtered, propeller pitch faltered. Wyman dove on the lead Zero, squeezed the trigger, and saw tracers walk across the fuselage. The Japanese fighter burst into flame, tumbling end over end through the thin air. His wingman followed with another kill moments later. Kaneko's voice crackled over the Japanese radio frequency. "They climb higher than us. Brake, dive." But it was too late. For the first time in the Pacific War, American carrier fighters held the vertical advantage. The altitude sanctuary, the last refuge of Japanese air superiority, had vanished in an instant. Wyman would later describe the sensation in his combat report. "We used to call it their sky. Now it's ours. They tried to go up and just stalled out, like eagles suddenly remembering they had no wings." When the battle ended, 12 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed for the loss of one Hellcat. The air war over Truk Lagoon became a slaughter so devastating that American pilots would later nickname it the Japanese Pearl Harbor. But the real shock came in Tokyo, when intelligence officers analyzed the combat reports. The American F6F had not only matched the Zero's maneuverability at altitude, it had exceeded it. Engineers at Nakajima were ordered to investigate how a radial-engined carrier fighter could operate effectively above 35,000 feet. Their conclusion, preserved in post-war archives, reads almost with disbelief. "The Americans have developed a pressure system beyond our understanding, a supercharger that keeps breathing where ours gasps." In reality, there was no new system, just a mechanic's forbidden idea quietly adopted without credit. At Patuxent River, the test division finally issued a revised ceiling rating for the F6F 37,900 feet. Officially, the improvement was due to incremental design refinements. Unofficially, the engineers who had handled Price's modified impeller knew better. Within months, new combat reports confirmed what pilots already felt in their bones. The Hellcat no longer had a ceiling. By the Marianas campaign in mid-1944, the Hellcat's dominance was absolute. During the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, F6Fs destroyed nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day. Many of those victories occurred at altitudes above 30,000 feet, precisely where, a year earlier, the Zero had reigned unchallenged. The U.S. Navy's after-action analysis listed supercharger performance improvements as a contributing factor to the astonishing kill ratio, 19-1. But in the footnotes of that same report lies a curious omission. There is no mention of the man who had risked his career for that performance, no price, no reference to any unauthorized modification, just the language of bureaucracy. Optimization of compressor geometry achieved through production tolerance revisions. In other words, the forbidden became standard. The irony was profound. In the Japanese Navy's final months, their engineers scrambled to retrofit water methanol injection and improved superchargers onto the new A7M Repu, a theoretical successor to the Zero. But shortages of materials and skilled labor rendered the effort futile. The Repu never reached mass production. Its prototype achieved a service ceiling of 35,000 feet, 2,000 lower than the late-war Hellcat. Price's quiet rebellion had, in the end, rewritten the vertical dimension of the Pacific War. By late 1944, as the Hellcats ranged over the Philippines and the South China Sea, their pilots had grown used to fighting where once they could not breathe. The thin air no longer belonged to the enemy. In the ready rooms aboard carriers like the Essex, they joked about it in their dry, tired way. "Hellcats climb to heaven," one ensign wrote on the chalkboard above the duty roster. Another added, "Zeros stay in hell." They laughed, but the laughter carried weight. Because every pilot there understood what altitude meant, it was more than a number. It was the difference between life and death, dominance and survival. When the war ended in 1945, and the Navy began compiling its engineering retrospectives, one small line item stood out among the reams of statistics. F6F model demonstrated exceptional performance at altitude, unanticipated during design phase. No one asked why. Eddie Price never returned to Grumman. Records show he left the company in 1944, finding work at a small aircraft maintenance firm on Long Island. He died in 1951, age 44, of a heart attack while repairing a civilian transport engine. He never knew that his impeller design, once condemned as a violation, became part of the standard blueprint for the R280010W family used in the final Hellcats and Corsairs of the war. In a quiet post-war interview, test pilot Bill Leonard, by then a Navy Cross recipient, was asked what he thought defined the Hellcat's success. His answer was simple. It forgave you. It climbed when it shouldn't. It was built by people who cared enough to cheat the rules. The journalist didn't understand what he meant, but the engineers at Grumman would have. The story of the Hellcat's ascent to 38,000 feet isn't one of heroism or luck. It's a story about belief, about a mechanic who refused to accept the limits of paper doctrine, and about a machine that proved him right. The Zero had ruled the Pacific through lightness and faith. The Hellcat conquered it through steel and stubbornness. And somewhere between those two visions of flight, between fragility and endurance, rose a sound no one had heard before. The song of a supercharger, climbing higher than the sky was ever supposed to allow. Autumn 1945. Bethpage, Long Island. The war had ended 2 months earlier. The banners were down, the production lines quiet. Where once the Grumman plant had echoed with the percussion of rivet guns, there was only silence, and the wind whispering through empty hangars. On a cracked concrete floor beneath Hangar 4, an old tool chest sat forgotten. The name scratched into its metal lid read, E. Price. A young draftsman, cataloguing leftover parts, found it one afternoon. Inside were scattered notes, a few rusted calipers, and a small notebook wrapped in oiled canvas. The cover bore 3 words written in block letters, 38 Special. Most of the pages were smudged with oil and graphite, diagrams of compressor impellers, equations scrawled in haste, performance graphs drawn by hand. On one page, a single sentence underlined twice. If they say it can't, it must. Perhaps it was thrown out, perhaps stored in an archive box and forgotten. But the idea it contained had already left its mark far beyond Bethpage. Because by the end of the war, altitude was no longer a luxury, it was a doctrine. The lessons of the Hellcat's climb became the foundation for post-war American aviation philosophy. When Grumman engineers began designing the F6F Bearcat, a lighter, faster successor, they retained the same high-efficiency compressor geometry that Price had pioneered. The Bearcat, powered by an uprated R2800, reached over 40,000 feet in test climbs, despite being smaller and half a ton lighter than the Hellcat. From there, the lineage continued. The same design principles that had been unauthorized in 1943 would influence the pressure ratios of the Pratt and Whitney J57 jet engine a decade later, an engine that would power aircraft at 50,000 feet and beyond. Altitude, once a forbidden realm, had become the measure of progress itself, yet history rarely remembers the hands that made the impossible real. The official Navy histories mention Grumman's engineers, the Bureau's oversight, the pilot's valor, but not the mechanic who refused to believe that good enough was good enough. In that omission lies a quieter truth about the industrial war that defined the 20th century. Victory did not belong solely to generals or admirals, nor even to the pilots who risked their lives above the Pacific. It belonged also to the anonymous, to the machinists, welders, and mechanics who lived in the shadows of blueprints, bending metal and rules alike. The irony was that both sides in the Pacific War had begun with the same dream, to build a perfect machine that could lift man beyond his limits. The Japanese had pursued perfection through purity of form and faith. The Americans, through relentless iteration and defiance of failure. By 1945, those two philosophies met for the last time in the sky over Tokyo Bay. Hellcats of Task Force 38 flew high cover as the surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri. Their altimeters read 38,000 feet, the same ceiling that Price had once scrawled in the margins of his calculations. Below, the bay was calm. The war that had begun in fire ended in silence. From that height, the aircraft carrier decks looked like pale rectangles upon the water, the ruins of Tokyo like grey scars beyond the shoreline. The pilots could see everything, the clouds, the islands, the vastness of the Pacific that had once seemed unconquerable. One of them, Lieutenant Jack Wyman, later wrote in his diary, "We used to say the sky had a ceiling. I don't think it does anymore." He was right. The Hellcat's climb had become more than a technical achievement. It was a symbol of transformation. It marked the moment when American aviation ceased reacting to its enemies and began defining its own laws of flight. It was the transition from imitation to innovation, from fighting to building. But it was also a testament to something older, more human, that in every workshop, in every generation, there exists someone who looks at the rules and decides they are only suggestions. Edward Price never lived to see the jet age his heresy helped create. Yet in every afterburner that howled beyond the sound barrier, in every contrail that arced into the stratosphere, a faint echo of his defiance remained. Because in the end, the sky belongs not to those who follow its limits, but to those who refuse to accept them. And so, when historians write of the F6F Hellcat, the fighter that destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft, that turned the tide of the Pacific War, they often speak of its armor, its guns, its pilots' courage. But somewhere beneath those numbers lies a quieter victory, a mechanic's stubborn belief that an engine could climb higher than the manuals allowed, that a single curve, filed by hand into a supercharger blade, could tilt the balance of a war. In the silence of a post-war hangar, that idea lingers, still waiting for someone to open a forgotten toolbox and remember that progress has always begun with a whisper of defiance. Autumn rain fell softly over Bethpage in 1951. In the rusted shadows of Hangar Four, a mechanic named Edward Price collapsed beside a half-assembled engine. The men who found him said he had been laughing just before he fell, a thin, wheezing laugh, the kind that sounded more like disbelief than joy. He died with his hands blackened by oil, a wrench still resting on the cowl of an R2800-cylinder bank. Few at Grumman remembered him. Production had long since shifted to jets, the old warbirds retired to boneyards or museums. But somewhere, in the hum of every turbine that followed, there was an echo of his rebellion, a reminder that progress often begins with someone saying no to certainty. Because that was what Price had done 8 years earlier when he filed a new curve into a forbidden impeller. He wasn't chasing glory, or patents, or medals. He was chasing breath, the thin, oxygen-starved air that the manuals said a Hellcat engine could not survive. And yet, survive it did. When the Navy declassified its wartime engineering reports in the late 1942, one entry stood out to aviation historians. Unexpectedly, high manifold pressure retention in high-altitude test models of the F6F, believed due to revised impeller geometry. No name was attached, no photographs, no signatures. But among the engineers who had worked the night shifts at Bethpage, the truth was an open secret. The revised geometry was not the product of a design bureau. It came from a single mechanic's stubbornness, a man who refused to accept that the ceiling of a machine should also be the ceiling of imagination. That quiet defiance did not merely lift a plane, it shifted an entire war. At Truk Lagoon, at the Marianas, over the grey skies of Leyte Gulf pilots who once feared the thin air began to hunt within it. They rose where zeros stalled, where thin air once belonged to the enemy. They discovered that altitude was not a gift of design, but a conquest of persistence. Each climb, each victory, carried a trace of that forbidden impeller, a secret ripple in the flow of air, turning pressure into power. When the war ended, the world climbed higher still. The engineers who had built the Hellcat went on to shape the jet age. The Pratt & Whitney J-57, descendant of the same engineering lineage, would power aircraft to 50,000 feet and beyond. The lessons born in the crucible of the Pacific efficiency of compression, faith in experimentation, became gospel for a new generation. By 1957, American pilots were breaking the sound barrier. They spoke of Mach instead of altitude, of heat instead of lift. But the philosophy was the same. Find the limit, and then question it. Every whisper of the compressor, every metallic whine as pressure rose in the intake, was the ghost of the Hellcat's climb. Eddie Price never saw the jets take flight. His name never appeared in the history books. Yet decades later, when restorers examined the surviving blueprints of the late model R2-80010W, they found small, undocumented changes, curves that matched no official revision, but mirrored the shape of an experimental impeller found in a scrap bin at Bethpage. One historian, in a private letter to the Smithsonian, wrote, "Somewhere between the drafts and the doctrine, a single man's idea became the standard. That was his victory. Not medals, not parades, but influence, invisible and enduring. If you stand today beneath the preserved F6F at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center, the placard reads, 'The Hellcat dominated the Pacific War. It was rugged, forgiving, and unmatched at altitude.' No one mentions that the altitude was an accident of rebellion, but if you lean close enough, if you listen past the silence of history, you might hear it, the faint hum of a supercharger rising against resistance, the whisper of metal and air conspiring to prove that limits are only temporary. What remains most remarkable about the Hellcat's story is not its speed or its kill ratio, but its symbolism, because the Pacific War was, in its essence, a conflict between two philosophies of creation. The Japanese built perfection through elegance and precision machines, like the Zero, light as breath, flawless but fragile. The Americans built endurance through defiance machines that weren't perfect but refused to fail. The Zero ascended like a prayer, the Hellcat endured like a promise. And somewhere in that contrast lies the story of the century that followed the age when humanity learned that innovation was not about purity of design, but persistence of will. Years after Price's death, his daughter donated his notebooks to a local aviation museum. The curator, flipping through yellowed pages of equations and grease stains, found a line written at the bottom of one sheet: "If a man stops at the ceiling, the sky dies with him." The curator framed the note and hung it beside a photo of a Hellcat climbing through cloud. No one outside that small town ever saw it, but for those who did, it said more about progress than any textbook could. Because the story of the Hellcat, of every warplane, every breakthrough, every idea that dared to breathe thinner air, is ultimately the story of human restlessness, the desire to rise, to question, to climb, even when the numbers say no. And maybe that's why, 80 years later, when a jet traces a white scar across the blue, we still look up and feel something older than war, something closer to faith. Faith that there will always be another mechanic in another hangar, somewhere, who refuses to stop filing, who keeps shaping metal until it matches a dream. Because in the end, the sky never truly belonged to those who followed its rules. It belonged to those who broke them and built something stronger in their wake. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.